We know that free trade maximizes world output and benefits all nations. However, practically all nations impose some form of restrictions on the free flow of international trade. One such restriction is the imposition of a tariff or an import duty. A tariff is the simplest form of trade policy, and it is a tax which is imposed on a good when it is imported. Tariffs are the oldest form of trade policy and have been traditionally used as a source of government income as well. The importance of tariffs has declined in modern times because modern governments are usually preferring non tariff barriers. Moreover, the import quotas and other forms of export restraints also exist. Understanding the effects of a tariff is vital for understanding other trade policies. In the previous modules, we have studied the partial equilibrium analysis of tariff with the loss of economic welfare to the nations and to its consumers. The incidence of tariff, as studied, falls entirely on the tariff imposing country, and the price of the good imported as well as the domestically produced import replacement goods or import substituted goods rises by the full amount of the tariff. Moreover, the tariff also results in the import reduction in the home country. With the reduction in imports, there will be a fall in the exports of the foreign country, and hence its price, depending on whether the importing country is large or small, would be affected. So, to judge the effects of tariffs on the economic welfare of the tariff imposing country, we have to go beyond the partial equilibrium analysis of tariffs. In this respect, the general equilibrium approach becomes very important in evaluating the welfare effects of tariffs.
After studying this module, you will be able to learn the general equilibrium effects of tariff, study the impact of tariff on a small country, analyze its effect when a nation imposing the tariff is a large country, and study the terms of trade effect and welfare impact under general equilibrium analysis. Now we will understand the effects of an import tariff on the nation imposing the tariff. A small nation is here defined as one that does not affect the world price of the commodity that it imports. That is, a small nation can import all it wants at the given world price of the commodity. Imagine that nation 1 produces and consumes two goods, good X and good Y. Nation 1 is small and so it is unable to affect the terms of trade. We assume here that nation 1 exports commodity X and imports commodity Y. So the country sells its commodity X to the world market at a given world price Px and buys commodity Y at the price Py. The figure shows the position of the nation in the absence of tariff. Nation 1 will maximize its welfare by producing at that point where the domestic ratio of marginal costs equals the world terms of trade. The nation produces at the point on its production possibility frontier that is tangent to the line with the slope Px by Py as indicated by Q1. This line is the economy's budget constraint where all the consumption points it can afford. So the nation chooses the point and consumes where the budget line is tangent to the highest possible indifference curve, that is, at point D. When the government of a nation imposes a tariff, its offer curve rotates away from the axis measuring its export commodity by the amount of the import tariff. The reason is that for any amount of the export commodity, importers now want sufficiently more of the import commodity to also cover the tariff. Let us suppose that the government imposes a tariff on its import of commodity Y. The price of commodity Y will increase for both the consumers and the producers, which will cause the divergence between the domestic terms of trade and the world terms of trade. This situation of tariff is shown in figure 2. With the tariff, the domestic terms of trade become equal to the slope of DD, that is, domestic price line, which is flatter than TT, that is, world price line, indicating the higher relative price of commodity Y. So, the tariff drives the wedge between the domestic and external price ratios, which can be seen as the angle between the two price lines, that is, DD and TT. The higher price of commodity Y induces nation 1 to expand commodity Y and reduce commodity X. So, with this production point moves to Q2, where the domestic price line, that is DD, is tangent to the production possibility curve. As here we are assuming that the world price ratio remains unchanged, so the international trade takes place along the line Q2C, which is parallel to TT. A new equilibrium in consumption is reached when two conditions are satisfied. A domestic price line EE, whose slope is equal to the tariff distorted domestic price ratio, is tangent to a community indifference curve, and the world price line P2C2 intersects the community indifference curve at its point of tangency with the domestic price line EE. The conditions mentioned before are satisfied at the point C. So, in the first condition, the marginal rate of substitution in consumption equals the domestic price ratio facing consumers, and the second condition satisfies the requirement that the domestic price ratio diverges from the world price ratio in proportion to the tariff imposed by the government. So, in the figure, the nation 1 continues to export X and import Y, but in smaller quantities as compared to the situation of before tariff. Tariff has stimulated the domestic production of commodity Y and hence reduces its dependence on commodity Y imports. Nation 1 has also reduced domestic output and exports of commodity X and reduced the welfare as shown by the movement to the lower indifference curve from I2 to I1. So, hereby we reach the same conclusion that in both general and partial equilibrium analysis, if the nation is small, then the tariff reduces national welfare. We will now examine the effects of an import tariff in a large nation, which is defined as a nation that affects the world price of the commodity by its trading. The terms of trade effect of a tariff can also be seen with the help of offer curves. Offer curve of a nation shows how much of its import commodity the nation demands for it to be willing to supply various amount of its export commodity. The tariff will result in either an increase in the volume of trade or decrease in the volume of trade. Both will be examined in this module. As shown in the figure, the initial offer curve of Nation 1 and Nation 2 are OA and OB respectively. Nation 1 exportable good is commodity X, which is Nation 2 import good, and Nation 2 export good is commodity Y, which is Nation 1 import good. The free trade equilibrium, as shown in the figure, takes place at point P, where the two nations' offer curves intersect each other. The terms of trade line is OT, corresponding to the free trade equilibrium. Now consider the situation when the tariffs are imposed by Nation 1. The offer curve of Nation 1 will shift to the left, and OA1 becomes the new tariff displaced offer curve. The new offer curve of Nation 1 intersects Nation 2 curve OB at point Q. Consequently, the new terms of trade line would be OT1. The new post-tariff trade equilibrium takes place at point Q. At point Q, Nation 1 tariff imposing country exports OD amount of X and imports QD amount of Y. Out of QD amount of commodity Y, QE amount is collected as revenue from import tariff. Thus, the imposition of tariff has reduced the volume of trade, but it has improved Nation 1's terms of trade. The reduction in the volume of trade by itself tends to reduce Nation 1's welfare, while the improvement in its terms of trade tends to increase Nation 1's welfare. Whether the nation's welfare actually rises or falls depends on the net effect of these two opposing forces. The optimum tariff is the tariff that maximizes the net benefit resulting from the improvement in the nation's terms of trade against the negative effect resulting from the reduction in the volume of trade. After the imposition of tariff, when the trade equilibrium point moves from P to Q, the two results found are: first, the volume of trade between the two nations has decreased because of the tariff, and second, the terms of trade have improved for the tariff imposing nation 1. The ratio of exports divided by imports has decreased since OD by DQ is smaller than OF by FP. This implies that Nation 1, after the imposition of tariff, receives more imports per unit of exports than was the case before the tariff was imposed. The terms of trade improvement for country A is also seen by the fact that the angle T1OF at point O is larger than the angle TOF at the same point. This finally indicates that the post-tariff terms of trade for Nation 1 has improved as compared to the free trade situation. This is only possible when we assume that Nation 2 does not retaliate. Hence, the increase in welfare benefit that Nation 1 receives from its optimum tariff, however, comes at the expense of Nation 2, which loses both because of the reduction in the volume of international trade and the deterioration in its terms of trade. As we have seen in the previous section, the optimum tariff is the one that maximizes the net benefit that results from an improvement in the nation's terms of trade against the negative effect resulting from a reduction in the volume of trade. That means starting from a free trade position, as the nation increases its tariff rate, its welfare increases up to a maximum, that is, the optimum tariff, and then declines as the tariff rate is raised past the optimum. With a high enough or prohibitive tariff, the nation will eventually be pushed back towards the autarky point. However, when two nations trade, as the terms of trade of the nation imposing the tariff improves, those of the trade partner deteriorates, since they are the reciprocal of the terms of trade of the tariff imposing nation. Facing both a lower volume of trade and worsening terms of trade, the trade partner's welfare will definitely fall. As a result of this, the trade partner is likely to retaliate and hence impose an optimum tariff on its own, while recapturing most of its losses with the improvement in its terms of trade. Retaliation by the trade partner will definitely reduce the volume of trade still further. The first nation may then again retaliate. In the end, all nations will end up losing all or most of the gains from trade. Also, even when the trade partner does not retaliate when one nation imposes the optimum tariff, the gains of the tariff imposing nation are less than the losses of the trade partner, so that the world as a whole is worse off than under the case of free trade. Therefore, in this sense, free trade maximizes world welfare. Now, if the other nation retaliates, the situation would be different. The retaliation comes in the form of an imposition of an import tariff of its own to recapture its loss in its terms of trade. As shown in the figure, once Nation 2 resents this action and responds by imposing tariffs of its own, then the offer curve of Nation 2 would move to the right from OB to OB1. The tariffs displaced offer curve of Nation 1 and Nation 2, that is, OA1 and OB1, would intersect at point M, where the new trade equilibrium will be established. When Nation 1 imposes a tariff, Nation 2 loses. The volume of trade of Nation 1 declines, but Nation 1's terms of trade improves. Since Nation 2 loses, it is likely to retaliate with an import tariff of its own, which rotates its offer curve to OB prime, giving the new equilibrium at M. Nation 2 has now recaptured all the loss in its terms of trade, but the volume of trade has shrunk considerably so that both nations suffer a welfare loss. The results found under this situation are: the volume of trade is further reduced as compared to the previous two equilibrium points, that is, P and Q, and the terms of trade are back at the level where they were with the free trade, because M and P lie on the same terms of trade line, OT, that is, free trade terms of trade line. So, in this situation, Nation 1 terms of trade failed to improve as the tariff action met with the retaliation by Nation 2. Thus, both nations have suffered a welfare loss and are worse off with tariffs than with free trade. This type of analysis is called a general equilibrium analysis because it shows the effect of a tariff on both nations and both commodities. If nation 2 offer curve is perfectly elastic, the terms of trade cannot be improved by the tariff imposing country nation 1. As shown in the figure, the offer curve OB of nation 2 is perfectly elastic, which is a straight line, and OA is nation 1 offer curve. The free trade equilibrium is at P, where the two offer curves OA and OB intersects. The slope of line OB also corresponds to the terms of trade between the two nations. When nation 1 imposes tariff, we get A prime Q, which is its tariff displaced offer curve. The post-tariff trade equilibrium is at point Q, where the tariff displaced offer curve of nation 1, OA prime, intersects the initial offer curve of nation 2, OB. There has been no change in the terms of trade as Q and P lie on the same terms of trade line. The only result is the reduced volume of trade. Will tariffs improve the terms of trade or keep them unchanged is explained as follows. If the tariff imposing country is a small country relative to the rest of the international economy, that its reduced volume of imports have no effect on the world demand for the imported product, then the international terms of trade would remain unchanged. Such a country suffers loss of welfare as a result of tariff action. If, however, the tariff imposing country is a large country, in fact, so large that its reduced import from the rest of the world would cause a substantial fall in demand for the imported product, the terms of trade would improve in favor of the tariff imposing country. The reduced import demand from such a large country would lead to a collapse in world demand for that import product, leading to a severe fall in its price. Such a large country will enjoy lower import prices relative to its export price and thereby enjoys favorable terms of trade.
Now let us summarize what we have studied in this module. Although free trade maximizes world welfare, most nations impose some form of trade restriction which benefit some special group within the country. The most important type of trade restriction traditionally, historically, has been tariff. As we know, tariff is a tax or an import duty which is imposed on the goods which are imported into a country. Uh, most often these tariffs are only imposed on imports but sometimes there may be export restraining tariffs as well. The effect of a tariff on different nations depends on whether the nation is small or large. When a tariff is imposed on a small nation, the domestic price of the importable commodity rises by the full amount of the tariff. The import tariff reduces the domestic consumption of the commodity, it increases the domestic production and reduces imports and leads to tariff revenue, and it redistributes income from the domestic consumers who pay a higher price for the commodity to domestic producers who receive a higher price. The tariff thus leads to inequalities, and also it leads to inefficient pricing within the domestic economy. When a large nation imposes a tariff, the burden of the incidence of the tariff falls on partly on the domestic producers in the form of higher price that is paid for the imported commodity, and partly on foreign producers in the form of a lower price that they receive for the commodity. If the welfare loss to the nation suffering the decline in the volume of trade is smaller than the welfare gain for the nation which receives the improvement in terms of trade, the nations as a whole stand to gain or benefit from a tariff. The optimum tariff is one which maximizes the net benefit resulting from the improvement in one nation's terms of trade against the negative effect of resulting a reduction in the volume of trade. When a nation imposes an optimum tariff, the trading partner's welfare declines because the lower volume of trade, and because of the lower volume of trade and the deterioration in the terms of trade. The trading partner is likely to retaliate, and in the end both nations are likely to lose out on account of the reduction in the volume of trade. Therefore, there is a grave potential that if we have tariffs, if we impose tariffs as a nation, then there would be also something called retaliatory tariffs, and this would not lead to an increase in the volume of trade, but by and by both the nations would suffer because the volume of trade would start declining. A general equilibrium approach as studied is very important for judging the welfare impact of tariff. When the tariffs are imposed by a country on its imports, import substitution would take place in the tariff imposing country. This leads to the contraction in the output of the other producing sector of the economy, because the resources would be drawn into the import replacement sector or the import substituting sector and away from the other sectors of the economy. This implies that there is a reallocation of the country's resources in favor of the import substituting industry and perhaps away from the other segments in the domestic economy, as well as away from the export oriented industry or sector of the economy.